Hi, Susan.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Very good. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Let me introduce us. I am Robert Wright of Blogging Hits TV. You are Susan Cain, author of the best-selling book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts, World That Can't Stop Talking.
There it is.
There it is. And I mean a real bestseller. It's been on the New York Times list more than a couple of months now, I think. This is serious. This is striking a chord in America's heart.
Yeah. It just hit 10 weeks on the bestseller list, and I was just over in London and debuted over there too, number 3 on the list. So
there are introverts in London?
Chord. I'm sorry?
There are introverts in London?
There are a lot of introverts in London. Yeah, they seem to be all over the world because I've been hearing from people, in every country, from every country imaginable.
And you often get the sense that they feel they've kind of been neglected or are oppressed by the nature of the modern world or something, and that they're really latching on to you as kind of giving them a voice or something?
I think that what the book is doing is articulating something that people have been feeling for a long time. I mean, I think for many people they've been feeling a sense of a culture that's biased against them really since the time that they were little kids. And in some cases they've articulated it consciously to themselves, but then never out loud. And in other cases, I think it's something people have felt, but not really ever given voice to, even to themselves. And so the book is giving people permission to talk about these things for the first time.
Okay. And the book is told from the heart. You are an introvert.
Yeah.
And say a little bit about what you mean by that. You do refer a lot in the book to the psychological literature on introversion, but at the same time you stress that you're not using the term in a highly, highly technical sense. So tell us what you mean when you say you're an introvert.
Yeah, because, one of the things that I found when I started looking at the psychological literature is that truly there are as many definitions of this word as there are personality psychologists. Every psychologist has their own favorite meaning for what it is. And I was really interested in the way that these terms affect us in our day-to-day lives and in our culture, as opposed to what pinning down the exact technical definition. But having said all that, what I'm really talking about is people who are more sensitive to stimulation, and so they prefer environments that are quieter and lower key. They need time to themselves, more time than is usually given to us by our culture. And I think it's important to look at it this way, because what people often think of when you say the word introvert, you think you're talking about somebody who's very asocial or antisocial. They imagine that you're talking about a kind of hermit in the woods. And it's really not that at all, but rather,
right.
Many introverts would rather, they want to socialize with close friends. They want to socialize with family. They want to be with people they know. They want to be able to recharge.
They're not necessarily shy, although, I mean, you take pains to distinguish those as dimensions of personality. At the same time, they're more likely to be shy in the common sense, right?
Yeah, this too is one of these things that psychologists don't really agree on. To what extent do they overlap? It really is a different phenomenon. Shyness is much more a person who's really afraid of negative judgment and is much more likely to imagine that somebody is judging them harshly than to imagine that they're being seen in a positive light. Now, in practice, the two phenomena do overlap. So introverts, many introverts report being shy, although some don't. I think there's also a sense in which some introverts are probably not technically shy, but having grown up in a world where they're constantly getting the message that the way that they prefer to spend their time is wrong, that can kind of make you shy over time, because it can make you feel like the way you are is not approved of by those around you.
Okay, so what are some of the ways the world does this, the modern world? How is it working against?
Well, you can kind of take it through a person's lifespan. So it starts from the time children are very, very young. They're immediately introduced into, let's say, preschool environments, where the idea of a preschool often is to sit and participate in big group settings. So it's kind of like a maximally stimulating environment. And a child in that setting who really prefers to play by themselves or to play quietly with just one or two others can often feel from the get-go that the way they want to spend their time is not what is mandated. So it begins then. It also happens sometimes at the hands of very well-meaning parents. Parents who want the best for their kids will push them to be more social, to be more extroverted, because they sense that this is what will equip them to compete in the modern world. But what the children take away is the sense that there's something wrong with who they are. And they're often compared unfavorably to more extroverted sisters and brothers and that kind of thing. Then you continue on through the school years, and now more and more our classrooms are being structured as big group settings where kids they're not working anymore autonomously or independently in projects. They're working kind of as committee members to learn. And for a kid who really prefers to be by themselves, working autonomously, or to be working in quiet settings, just the mere act of going to school can be a quite overwhelming experience, even if they like their classmates perfectly well. And then you get into the workplace, and what we find is that extroverts are much more often groomed for leadership positions than introverts are, even though there's research showing that introverts make really fine leaders, I think quite counterintuitively. And also our workplaces now, you and I are sitting here right now in our home offices, but that's not the case for most people. Most people are going to work in big, noisy, open plan settings where there are no walls and where you are in a room, sometimes full of hundreds of people with everybody kind of looking at each other all day long. And that can be a difficult thing if you're somebody who prefers a quieter setting.
Right. And now on the business of parents kind of encouraging their introverted kids to be more extroverted, I mean, there's a sense in which, according to your critique of contemporary society, they are preparing them for success because in certain senses, there is a kind of bias in favor of extroversion. I mean, for example, getting into elite universities, right? I mean, the admissions committees do prefer extroverts, right?
Well, I don't think that they explicitly prefer extroverts. I think what happens is, especially nowadays, the admission standards are so high that the way they distinguish between kids is they're looking for kids with a long list of extracurricular activities. You have to have been the leader of 17 different organizations often to get into a good school.
Right.
And so that ends up often equating to extroversion or a more extroverted persona. So from the point of view of parents, it really is a tricky thing. But the best thing that parents can do for kids who are more introverted, and we're talking, by the way, about a third to a half of children, so this is a lot of kids. The best thing they can do is really communicate to them that the way they are is quite wonderful, and let them go and spend the time that they need alone and working on their projects quietly. But then also just equip them with the skills that they need to be more extroverted when they need to be. So to kind of present it to them as a skill set that the children can adopt as needed, as opposed to saying you need to change your whole self. And this applies to grown-ups too. I think that introverted grown-ups who want to feel at peace with themselves and be operating maximally really do need to honor their own temperaments, but then be able to kind of adopt an extroverted skill set just as needed.
Yeah, I mean, you've got kind of a list of things at the end of the book that people should feel comfortable doing. I mean, if they're introverts, listen to the inner introvert. One that kind of resonated with me was cross the street to avoid making aimless chit-chat with random acquaintances. That's not quite what I do, but let me tell you what I do and tell me if this means I'm an introvert. I mean, in other words, if it's an actual neighbor, if it's somebody I know, I don't try to avoid them. But one thing that's very uncomfortable for me when we don't have a very heavily trafficked sidewalk. You'll walk along a while and not see anybody, but then every once in a while you'll see somebody and you don't know them. And I find the moment of approach with someone you don't know extremely uncomfortable because there's this awkwardness about whether you shouldn't shouldn't you acknowledge the presence of another human being or something. Is that me being an introvert?
Well, I mean, it might be being an introvert. I think extroverts can feel the kinds of ways you're describing also. What I've actually found is that a lot of people resonate with the piece of advice that you just quoted about crossing the street to avoid random chit-chat. And yet people experience it in different ways. So for some people, it's more the making small talk with a neighbor. And for other people, it's what you just described. But I think it's just in general, what it really is just a sense that you don't want to have to be on all the time, that you want to kind of be left alone with your thoughts and not have to be stepping into the mode of self-presentation when you're just walking along.
And then relatedly, it's not that you don't enjoy conversation, but as an introvert, you're inclined not to like small talk. And this, for me, is a major frustration at dinner parties, is not being able to find something that's actually important, at least to me, and talk and pursue it in a sustained way, almost like, in a seminar like way or something.
Right.
And that is an impatience with small talk is, I gather, characteristic of introverts, but doesn't mean they don't like talk. They like deeper talk, sometimes involving only one person or a few people. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. Deeper talk about a subject that they find really interesting with people who they like, one other person or a few other people. The phenomenon of small talk is interesting because there was actually a study that was done recently that found that nobody's happy when they're engaged in small talk. Introverts and extroverts alike, they all prefer deep talk. But what is different about introverts and extroverts is that introverts find the process of small talk just more stressful and more unpleasant. I think extroverts can more easily just wade their way through it until they get to the talk on the other side. And then also, for the talk on the other side, introverts tend to really like to go deep in ways that extroverts don't necessarily crave. And one interesting thing that's been found is that when introverts and extroverts talk to each other, they often enjoy each other's company because the introverts can feel as if the extroverts kind of lighten things up for them in ways that they welcome. And extroverts will feel sort of the converse, that introverts will introduce more serious subjects that the extroverts might not have gone to themselves or felt permission to go to. But for introverts, that's where they live.
And the introverts tend to be better listeners and more inclined to focus on the issues that the other person is presenting. Is that right? I mean, do they make better kind of counselors?
Often introverts really like that role. They like the role of listening. Among psychologists, you find a lot of introverts. That's the kind of one-on-one conversation where you're listening really carefully and intently and letting the other person do a lot of the talking. That's the kind of mode that's very comfortable for introverts. And it's not to say that they can't do the talking when they need to, but they often prefer to be in listening mode. Okay.
And then one more thing about kind of identifying introverts before we talk more about the social dimension.
Yeah.
You mentioned that they're sensitive to stimulation, and that might by itself sound a little odd to people, or a little odd to people, because you think of an extrovert as someone who likes stimulation, right? And presumably they're enjoying it and are sensitive to it in that sense. But it turns out that one way to identify that a child is likely an introvert is their degree of sensitivity to things, but sometimes in an aversive way, right? I mean, they're high reactive. Is that the term?
Oh, yeah. And I'll talk about the children in a minute, but just to clarify the thing about stimulation, what it really is, one way to think about it that I talk about in the book is what is your sweet spot for the amount of stimulation that's coming at you? Mm-hmm. So extroverts, they feel most energized when they're getting a lot of stimulation thrown at them. Lots of noise, lots of social activity, mm-hmm. whatever it happens to be. And introverts feel at their most alive and at their most energized with less stimulation coming at them. So everybody likes stimulation, and for introverts and extroverts alike, when you're not getting enough of it, you feel kind of bored and restless and unhappy. But introverts need less of it to get to their sweet spot. Now talking now about high reactive kids who you were just asking about, you can see this from the time babies are born. Babies who are so-called high reactive, meaning more reactive to stimulation, these babies from earliest infancy, they react more strongly when you throw stimulation at them. So even something like if you give a 4-month-old baby a new mobile that they've never seen before, little shapes and colors floating over their head, a more high reactive baby is going to thrash their arms around more, pump their legs more in reaction to this very simple stimulus. And that same baby is more likely to grow up to be more shy or more introverted or both.
And high reactive kids, I mean, there's a number of things that are true about high reactive kids, right? They, I mean, first of all, when they are, they tend to ponder choices and decisions longer or something, right? I mean, and it just, if you just kind of track eye movements, if they're taking account of something, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, in that sense, high reactive is misleading because it's almost as if they give more thought to their ultimate reactions, right? I mean,
yeah, it's like they're more careful. They're sort of processing incoming information at a deeper level. That's really what they're doing. So yeah, what you were talking about, like if in the lab, if you give these kids, you know, the kinds of games where you have two pictures of things and the two pictures look very similar, but they have very subtle differences between the two of them. So children who are more high reactive will spend more time inspecting the differences between these two pictures, and they'll more often figure out what the right answer is. And the same thing continues, you know, into adulthood. If you give introverts who are not always, but often high reactive, if you give introverts difficult mazes to solve, like a maze puzzle, they will spend more time inspecting the puzzle before they even begin it than an extrovert will. And then when they actually delve into the puzzle, they spend more time working their way through it and more often get the right answer.
And this holds true of introverts in adulthood in terms of their preferring to really ponder and assess something before rendering a verdict.
Exactly. One psychologist phrased it as introverts are geared to inspect and extroverts are geared to react.
So this gets to, you know, an example of a reason that you might not want the world to be entirely dominated by extroverts. I mean, in other words, you know, if our elite universities are indeed kind of biasing their admissions, consciously or unconsciously, in favor of extroverts, and if they are the gateways to power in society, you know, you might ask, is that really a good thing if you're kind of systematically excluding people who, when they see a problem, will actually think about it? You know?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You know, and what I say all the time is that I think of introverts and extroverts as being a kind of yin and yang, and we really need both types. You know, so we need the extroverts who sort of charge ahead without stopping to think that much, because that's a form of action and it's a form of getting things done, and it's great. But we also need the people who sit and assess and really think carefully about problems. You know, and I think that this is part of what went wrong in Wall Street. You know, Wall Street was a culture that rewards people who are more on the extroverted side of being, you know, not in the social sense of that word, but in the sense of how do you react to new information that's coming your way? How do you react to warning signals? It's been shown repeatedly that introverts introverts process warning signals that are coming at them more than extroverts do. And when an extrovert sees a warning signal coming, they actually speed up as opposed to slowing down. So, you know, and in a culture like Wall Street, what you had was even people who are probably temperamentally more cautious, more introverted, learn over time that they can't act that way. You know, they can't be the one continually sounding alarm bells, because that's not the way you're going to get promoted. It's not the way you're going to gain respect. One of the people who I quote in my book was a guy whose name was Vincent Kaminsky, who had been at Enron during the months preceding the Great Collapse. And he relates an encounter that he had. He's an introvert, and he relates an encounter that he had with one of the kind of swashbuckling rainmakers of the firm, where Kaminsky was telling this guy that he couldn't do what he was doing, that he was taking risks that were not appropriate. And the guy starts yelling at him. And Kaminsky says, you know, he was a big rainmaker and I was an introverted nerd. So who do you think won that discussion? And, you know, so I think this is a perfect example of the problem. We need the swashbucklers for sure. We just need a better balance between...
Just need them to occasionally shut up.
And you know, and I think that we need more respect for the risk management function. You know, and it's not enough to just say, yes, let's have a risk management department and let's slap a title on this. There needs to be social status attached to these things, because otherwise it's never going to work ultimately.
Now, related to this, you know, I'm sure you don't want to come out and declare that introverts are morally better people than extroverts.
No.
But it is the case, isn't it, that there are correlations between the introverted personality type and some things that we associate with ultimately kind of moral behavior. For example, these high reactive kids who are likely to grow up to be introverts are more prone to feel guilty if they feel they've done the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And is there a correlation between the personality dimensions of introversion and conscientiousness?
Not introversion per se, but high sensitive people who are considered highly sensitive as adults often are unusually conscientious. I just want to stress that doesn't mean that people who are less reactive or people who are more extroverted are not conscientious. It just means that if you have this high reactive, more sensitive personality, you're more likely to develop those facets of conscientiousness. Yeah, and it's really interesting, with little kids. It turns out that the way that we form our consciences, in part, is you're a little kid, you do something that's wrong, and somebody reprimands you for it. And you feel bad about that. Like, the reprimand causes you anxiety. And you don't like the anxiety, so you learn not to do that thing again. And that's how your conscience forms. So if you take a little kid who is prone to be more anxious or more fearful, they internalize those reprimands all the more. And so it kind of deepens their conscience. I should say that that's true only if the reprimand is coming at them in a good and gentle way. Like if it's too much, then the kid might just flee from it completely.
Okay.
They're more sensitive. But these kids, later on, if you put them in a situation where they have the chance to win a prize and they think that they can lie or cheat or steal to get to the prize, and they think that nobody is watching them, kids who are more high reactive are less likely to lie and cheat, even if they think that they can't get caught.
Those are the kids who are more likely to grow up to be.
Exactly.
So introverts are good. I mean, I'm willing to come out and say it. The introverts are better than extroverts morally, and are going to heaven.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't say we're going to heaven?
Well, that gets into a whole. No, it's not. I don't think it's that simple. But I do think that.
Okay, I take it back. But but some other kind of interesting things. I mean, I may be wrong about some of these correlations, but I think I take away that introverts, they're more likely, and I don't know if these are childhood studies or adult studies or what, but they're more likely to delay gratification,
right?
To learn from mistakes, to not care about wealth.
Yeah. This is really interesting. So a lot of this gets to, there's actually a different neurochemistry between introverts and extroverts. So extroverts have more intense reward networks in their brain. The parts of your brain that process rewards, like anything from striking a good business deal to striking up a conversation with an attractive stranger. Your reward networks are involved with that. And extroverts feel more activated when they have the prospect of reward. And what that means is that they then have a whole slew of emotions that are associated with the prospect of reward. And it's those positive emotions that are part of what make extroverts such good company, because it's kind of an ebullience. They're sort of champagne bubble emotions that are nice to be around. But what happens is you can get so focused on going after your goal that you don't see warning signals that are coming your way. And so you take more risks, and it's harder for you to delay gratification.
Now, the social emphasis on extroversion, and you might say the exaltation of the extrovert as the ideal,
right,
is something that wasn't always with us by your account. I mean, you trace it all the way back to kind of urbanization 100 years ago. Dale Carnegie you see as a kind of a threshold, a sign of the times. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it's kind of it's a long-standing trend that almost continues unabated. Is that right? I mean, into even recent decades, the more and more value placed on extroverts.
Yeah. So it is, as you say, once around the turn of the 20th century, as people started leaving the small towns that they had been living in and moving to the cities and needing to suddenly stand out in a crowd of strangers, now they were suddenly in this world where they were no longer among people who knew them and who knew what their true character was. And what mattered was the first impression, and how charming could you be when you're making your first impression. So qualities like that were what came to matter, and those were often associated with extroversion. And so that's what led us to the kind of the situation we have now. And in fact, if you compare the self-help books from the 19th century that historians call the culture of character, and you compare those to the early 20th century self-help books where we had entered the so-called culture of personality, the self-help books were really different. So, for example, there was one guy named Horizon Sweat Martin. He was the best-selling self-help writer of his day. And in the 19th century, he wrote a book called Character, the Grandest Thing in the World. But by the 20th century, the same writer wrote a book called Masterful Personality. Where he was teaching, and he was teaching.
A flexible man.
Exactly, yeah. You know what, I think that's what people do. They kind of absorb the times. And he was absorbing what people wanted.
So he was probably an extrovert. I
don't know, because Dale Carnegie, who you were mentioning before, he actually was a very shy and kind of fretful kid. But he sort of looked around. He grew up in the late 19th centuries when he was a boy. He was growing up on a farm in this culture of character. But he looks around and he sees that the ticket to a better life than the one that he had grown up with is to be more of a sales type of person. So he starts teaching himself how to be a good public speaker. And he's not actually at first a good speaker, but he practices it over and over until he's good enough. And then he goes out on the road as a traveling salesman and eventually lands in New York and starts teaching other people public speaking. And then, going on to write his famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. So he's sort of a perfect example of how we got from A to B.
And so the shift, in terms of the environments that emphasize character as opposed to personality, part of it is that in the 19th century, you had a relatively small number of people who knew you very well.
Yeah.
And your success was dependent on their having a high opinion of you.
Right.
And so, it didn't put a premium on kind of superficial appeal.
Right.
It did put a premium on, sticking with your word and being somebody you can trust and so on. But increasingly since then, success for many people has depended on cultivating a larger network of people who are going to know you in a more superficial way or only along one dimension or something, right? And that leads more to the culture of personality.
Right, exactly.
And in the 50s, you saw a lot of sociological literature on this, William Wright, David Reesman, the idea of inner-directed versus other-directed, and all of that is a way of saying that the extroverted personality was valued more. But also, what worries me, as someone who I think is mainly an introvert, is that I think the changing environment, in other words, it wasn't an arbitrary choice that they valued extroversion. It wasn't just a fad. It's that the very structure of society, as it's still being changed by technology, really does make it a prerequisite for success that you be able to deal with a lot of different people that you don't really know very well. And it seems to me the World Wide Web and email and everything and Twitter and has only exacerbated that, right?
Well, I don't know that I would say that last part. I actually think that that the web and social media are opening up new avenues for introverts to be influential in ways that are comfortable for them. Because, what the internet does is it allows you to connect with gigantic numbers of people and to express your ideas to large numbers without necessarily leaving your house. So it's a way of doing that that's much less stimulating, going back to that formulation. You don't have to be going out and putting on a face all the time.
No, but don't you, I don't know which media you engage, Facebook or Twitter or what?
Yeah, both. And I have a blog as well.
Well, with like Twitter, don't you, when you're going to wade out there and say something, don't you feel some of the kinds of apprehensions you would feel going out to talk before a large audience, which in the book you say has been an issue for you?
Right.
And in a way, isn't it even worse because you can't see their faces and you don't really, and it's this, and you don't know exactly who they are. That's not a problem an introvert you think would necessarily have.
I've spoken to a lot of introverts about it. I think that some of them do feel, it's not ideal for them, but it's still actually I do think that there's still a lot less involved with sending out your tweet to the world than there is with engaging with people in real life. Because, There's something about having faces actually looking at you that I think triggers a kind of primal reaction inside the brain. And it's just not, that thing is not triggered when you're sitting quietly in a room by yourself. And in fact, one of the things I've noticed when I've been doing my book tour is, I've done a lot of radio shows, right? And I have found that probably 75 or 80% of the broadcasters who have interviewed me have said that they're introverts. And many of them have told me they could never go on TV because TV is like this thing where your face is out there. But there's something about being in a radio studio where you might know technically that millions of people are listening to you, but you don't process it that way viscerally. And I think the same thing is true with a Twitter or Facebook.
I'm told that Terry Gross actually tries to arrange it so that she's pretty rarely, if ever, actually face-to-face with the person she's talking to. I don't know if she's an introvert.
That's interesting.
But she likes to do it remotely. Okay, so technology isn't necessarily bad for us, and in some, bad for introverts, and in some ways you think it can be liberating. The classic example you say is you talk about the hacker example where there's collaboration online, but you make your contribution when you want to. So Steve Wozniak, a classic introvert, can participate in a collaborative project without surrendering kind of autonomy.
I think what's been ironic about that is that because of that, in the early days of the internet, many of these collaborative projects were, they were engaged in by people who are quite introverted, people who really like to work on their own, right? But then, in a way, they were so successful with their collaborations that we've now entered this period where collaboration has become a kind of sacred word. And so now everybody's about collaborating all the time in person as well. And that's actually been not a good trend for introverts who would prefer not to be working that way.
Right. So you think there's been this kind of facile transfer of the logic of collaboration that works very well in the online world. You think there's been a kind of a facile transplanting of that ideal, the ideal of collaboration, to the classroom and the workplace?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And, it's not to say that collaboration is a bad thing. Lennon and McCartney wouldn't exist without collaboration. Of course, to some degree, it's okay. It's just that, more than okay, it's great. It's just that it's almost like a joke now. You can't really ever, you can't you can't attend a business conference, you can't open up a business magazine without seeing the word collaboration. If you look at a company's brochure, they almost always will talk about how great they are at collaboration. It's become this kind of buzzword that's supposed to, that somehow advertises a kind of communitarian piety and also a devotion to creativity that I think is just kind of misplaced.
There's actual evidence, isn't there, that often it doesn't lead to productivity?
Yeah, one really interesting thing is that there have been decades of studies on brainstorming that have found that individuals who brainstorm on their own almost always produce more ideas and better ideas than groups of people brainstorming the exact same question. So we know this, and we've known this for decades. The one exception to this that I think is really instructive is that when people are brainstorming electronically, online, just the way the early internet pioneers did, in those cases, the electronic brainstormers often do better than the individuals. So that's why I'm saying, that collaboration online is not the same thing as collaboration in person. It needs to be managed really differently.
Well, you can certainly see why for introverts the online version is better, because it lets you share your ideas without having to react before you feel you've thought everything through. Exactly.
What introverts tell me all the time is that when they go to meetings, they feel like the conversation is moving so quickly. They're thinking about what's being said. And by the time they have their idea formulated, the conversation's moved on or the meeting is over. And so It's too late to participate. You put everybody into an online forum and all of that goes away.
So this is the sense in which the web is good for introverts.
Yeah, and I think it's huge.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's a line in your book, no wilderness, no revelations.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
That's kind of, of course it's a reference to famous sages ranging from Jesus to whoever else going off into the wilderness and having their revelations. And I guess you don't mean it too literally, but well, I mean, maybe the question is, what type of intellectual contribution do you think is lost if people aren't allowed to spend long amounts of time in contemplation?
Well, I think it's the contribution of knowing what you truly deeply think. What do you think on your own that other people don't think? And I'll just give you an example. When I was doing my book research, I did a lot of touring in classrooms, and there was one classroom where, I entered and the teacher said, "Here's a writer. Look, here she is. You can ask her any questions that you want." And so all the kids wanted to know, how can I be a writer too? And I said to them, you should start keeping a diary or a journal, and know that a journal that nobody else is ever going to see, because that is the only way that you're ever going to feel the total freedom to write down what you truly think and start kind of pushing your boundaries. And they looked at me totally mystified. They could not understand for the life of them why you would have a diary that no one was going to read. It was like a waste of time to them.
Really?
Yeah.
And you think that is a product of the environment that they've grown up in, and reaction would have been very different 60, 70 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. If you think of the diaries that used to be sold when we were growing up, I remember them in the stationery stores. They were these little books with gold-leafed edges, and they had a little lock and key on them.
Mm-hmm.
The whole point of it was that it was impersonal and private. But we've lost that sense. And
Yeah. How does that issue look in the context of the introversion, extroversion thing? I mean, we've heard a lot about how what some of us think of as threats to privacy posed by kind of digital technology, but what supposedly a lot of younger people don't mind. In other words, you hear that there's been a change in the view of privacy from generation to generation.
Right.
And that's a little bit what you're talking about.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I predict that there's going to be a backlash against this because it's too fundamental a human need. The need to go off by yourself, the need to think thoughts that nobody else is going to ever know you've thought. That's basic. And I think people are going to start to resist it. And I'm talking even about young people who have grown up in it. There's going to come the day when they understand what the repercussions are, and I think people will resist a little bit.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I remember when Twitter kind of first started getting attention a few years ago, a friend of mine said that the next logical step after Twitter is to just have electrodes implanted in everyone's brain so that their thoughts are automatically transmitted. But, I mean, this is kind of what I mean, gets at what I mean when I say that to some extent, I think there's an almost inexorable kind of clash between some aspects of the modern technology and being an introvert. I mean, for me, of course, I'm not necessarily typical. I mean, I have a blog and stuff like that, and that exposes you to all these commenters who hate you. But I have found that I really have to try to become less self-conscious and less concerned about what people think of me.
Right.
And that's, in a way, saying I need to become less of an introvert.
Yeah, but yes and no. I mean, the way I see it really is that what you need to do is push yourself for those moments, but that you'll be healthiest and at your most creative and most expressive if you are in general living in a way that suits you. But you'll consciously say every so often, okay, here's one of those moments where I'm feeling self-conscious, but for the sake of this work that I love, I'm going to push myself through that self-consciousness. But it doesn't mean you're going to change the basic core of who you are. I mean, I read your book, The Moral Animal. I love that book. I think I told you the other day. It is one of my favorite books. And it is. Well,
actually, what you said was that it's on your bedstand and you use it when you can't sleep. No. So I wasn't sure that I should take that as a compliment. But
such a compliment. No. What it is that I read it through, and then I have for nights when I can't sleep, I have like my favorite books of all time, and they keep me company if I can't.
I like it better that way. Thank you. I prefer that you use that formulation.
Okay, that's the one I'm going to use. Anyway, that's all a long way of saying your book is brilliant. It's really deeply thought out. It's really deeply researched. It's not the kind of thing that you could have done if you were just whipping stuff off, or if you were spending all your time socializing. You just can't produce a work like that.
And it was written before the internet.
Was it really?
Yeah. The internet was just happening. I think I maybe had email, but I remember this isn't about me, but just quickly, for part of the writing of it, my wife and I, this is before we had kids, we actually went off to an island for a winter because we could live. It turned out we could live basically cheaply there, and it was complete isolation, which now is impossible, right? I mean, you can't, unless you actually go out to a jungle or something.
Right.
And that's kind of what I mean, that it's tough to be an introvert in the modern world in some ways, to find the time. And part of what your book is about is making sure that you, if you're an introvert especially, carve out enough of that time so that then when you do move online, you've got something to say that you'll be happy you said.
Exactly. And I really have found that becoming more self-aware about these things and more conscious of them, and also more entitled to really be who you are. Once you have that sense of entitlement, then you can more easily carve out the times that you need to just be on your own and take those breaks from society. I think the problem ends up coming in where you don't feel that sense of entitlement, so therefore you're constantly pushing yourself to do stuff that you don't want to be doing.
Okay, so finally, you're in a mixed marriage, right? You don't necessarily recommend that introverts only hang out with other introverts.
No, not at all. I think introverts and extroverts are often drawn to each other. And I mean, I've seen happy marriages that are two introverts, but I think often there's a sense of introverts and extroverts feeling like they complete each other and that each one is good at stuff the other's not good at. I love it that my husband never runs out of anything to say. We never, we could be going on a 12-hour drive, and by hour 9, he'll still be coming up with stuff. And he doesn't even have to think about it. It just happens naturally. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know where these thoughts come from. But they do. And that's great to me. So I have found that in these marriages, there are conflicts, of course, that tend to come up from each having such different needs. But once you figure out where they're coming from, then you can work them through.
Okay, and your book has a lot of life advice like that, and draws very much on your experience. And people should watch your TED Talk too if they haven't seen that, which has at this point gotten about 7 billion views, I think. Right?
That's really been extraordinary. Yeah.
Where you talk about how you went off to summer camp as a kid and naively brought a bunch of books thinking, oh, quiet time. That's what summer camp is about, right?
Well, I mean, really what I thought, I grew up in a family where everybody loved to read, and so we would all sit around reading together, which to me was the greatest thing. And so I naively imagined that summer camp was going to be like that. So instead of my family sitting next to me and reading, it would be all my new friends sitting next to me and reading. But I was in for a rude shock. That wasn't true.
So anyway, you are a living example of surviving in a largely extroverted world and overcoming deep fears about speaking in public and so on, and you talk about all that stuff in the book. So
I mean, but again, I think that the reason that I can do it is because, especially over time, I've become more and more comfortable with who I really am. So I really give myself the time I need.
Yeah.
So
no, and I think really, I mean, the book had some of that effect on me of convincing me that I need to accept, the part of me that doesn't fit in naturally to the online world, for example.
Right.
And I mean, really, it made me really re-examine some things I'm doing, including how I'm making a living.
Are you comfortable saying what you're re-examining right now?
Well, it's I'm blogging now, and so I have to say something pretty much every day, and that's actually low by blogging standards. Say just if I only say one thing a day,
right?
But the truth is, I don't have one thing a day worth of to say that I really think is worth saying. And I hate the feeling that I put something out there that wasn't really worth saying.
Right.
And I'm having. I mean, there are ways around that. I think as a blogger, you can just calibrate your degree of confidence in what you're saying and stress that when you're you don't even have to express opinion. There are ways I'm sure I can continue to adapt, but and I also just realize I'm never going to be like a Twitter animal. I don't see how these people do it.
Right.
And that's life.
There are a lot of good bloggers who don't blog every day.
Yeah, there are. Blog is a very broad definition. But anyway, it certainly made me think a lot of things, and I think the thing about the book is even if you're not an introvert, I mean, there's an element of it that is social criticism, that is an observation about the kind of world we're living in, and so it's not surprising to me that this is really caught on, and that a lot of people see themselves in it, and that maybe even some of those who don't will see the world in it in a way they haven't thought of it before. Thank you for praising the book. If I can, I just want to come back to what you were saying before, because I really do believe that there's going to be a kind of backlash and rethinking about the way we use the internet, and I think probably the way a lot of your readers engage with somebody like you is they want your deeply considered thought. I mean, that's what's so great in your work. So I think that if readers come to know, okay, we're going to get Bob's deeply considered thought every 3 days instead of 3 times a day, that's going to be fine. Could be, but when you're actually getting paid to blog, you're not the only person who has to decide what quantities.
No, that's a whole other thing.
Anyway, not that I'm getting a lot of credit, but so anyway, really, congratulations. I don't know. I doubt you expected it to hit quite the chord it's hit. You've certainly had an experience that 99.7% of book writers don't get to have.
Yeah, it's been kind of crazy. I mean, it's funny because, of course, I could never have predicted this. No one ever could. The one piece of it that's not a surprise is just I've been working on this book since 2005. So by now I've spoken to thousands of people about their experiences being introverts. Because everywhere I went for all those years, all I had to do was say the title of the book I was working on, and people would tell me their life stories. And so I've just come to appreciate how much this topic resonates with even the most unlikely people. Some of them seem like obvious introverts, but a lot of them are not, because some of them are just introverts who got really good at acting like pretend extroverts. And so there are a lot of people walking around who feel these pressures. Oh, yeah.
No, I think because the world encourages that.
Yeah, exactly.
So they can find liberation.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Susan, thanks so much.
Thank you, Bob. I really enjoyed it.
For taking the time, and continued good luck in taking the world by storm.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.